Hey there. This is the first swipe file you get for welcome sequence. Here is I'm calling it kind of my prior welcome sequence. This was the welcome sequence I was using when basically my offers were just the legal stuff. So you'll see there isn't anything that kind of is a pivot to the business stuff. And I wanted to walk through it quickly. Now, in these training videos, I'm not going to walk you through each individual email in depth. You can look through them, see what I'm doing, but what you'll see is they're largely simply following the story email framework that you have in the resources section. The point of this is I wanted to give you a sense of how I kind of put things together and created the order and the different content that is in there. And so you'll see this is an email sequence from before I really had set my core values. I hadn't defined it, so you'll see there isn't any emails about core values. Nowadays, of course, I would have that in there. But what you'll see is that this email sequence, I kind of had three different emails that touch on origin story. The first is kind of where I really do introduce myself, where I, and you can see that right down here where you see the subject line is I'm not your typical Harvard law grad. So I'm setting credibility, but at the same time talking about, hey, but I'm not that person. I'm fun. I'm an entrepreneur. I am not your typical lawyer, because that was a part of my messaging for a long time. But then really the second and third emails are where I really kind of get into my origin story in more depth. The second one is where I talk about how I had made the mistake of jumping into a partnership without a written agreement, and the bad consequences that had for me, et cetera. And that's kind of leads to why I'm so passionate and I understand the importance of getting your agreements in writing. Again, foreshadowing that what I sell are agreements. I'm not talking about that in that email. I'm simply setting the stage and in a sense priming people for the notion that, hey, I get where you're at and I want to help you avoid the same mistake I made. Then the next email 3, I call it my content and my origin story. I used a bit of my origin story. If you know my story and you've heard me talk about that life coach who asked me the question of whether I liked what I was doing for a living when I was in my own law practice as a traditional lawyer, and I said no, and then she said, great, what are we going to do about that? So I kind of tell that story and tell the pivot to being an entrepreneur. So you can kind of see I tell my origin story through 3 emails. That was because at the time my origin was really weird, and my what I was trying to do is this origin story is really kind of a getting at a product in a lot of ways. It's foreshadowing the value of a product, and then this is how I became an entrepreneur. But I'm multi-purpose. This is also where I talked about one of the first things that life coach got me to do was thinking about podcasts, and I started my podcast. And so then you'll see this is an example. Email 3 here in this sequence is if you want to do a single email about content where you put multiple links to different pieces of content. That's what this one is. I talk about the podcast and then I link to, say, 3, 4, I don't remember how it was. Maybe it was 6 different podcast episodes and give them that idea. Then my next email is about a secondary freebie. This is where I introduce people to my free Online Genius Academy, which is this training academy that has lots of training about the legal stuff. Now, again, it's a secondary freebie, but just to be clear, it also sets the stage for products, because what it's doing, if you go through that, it often tells you what you need to do is you need to have this agreement in place. And then there's links where people can go and buy that in my store. So it's a freebie, but it's also a bit of a very soft sales mechanism, but I treat it as a secondary freebie here. Then my next email, I invite people to join my free Facebook community. That was kind of, again, the social media. That has always really been my core social media vehicle. So even way back then, that's what I focused on. And then the final email is about my product. I basically say, hey, I kind of talk about how that I talked about the academy, which will help you learn about the legal stuff, but knowing is only half the battle. You actually need to do work, and that's where my templates come in. So I introduce them to it, and I introduce them to the concept of my template library, my all-you-can-eat kind of, get everything, but also say I also have a template shop. So that's the flow of this welcome sequence. This is kind of what I would say in many ways will be a typical kind of starting welcome sequence for a lot of people, a 6 to 7 email sequence where you're doing these things. Again, as I said at the beginning, there is no core values because at the time I wrote this sequence, I hadn't established my core values. Now, even though I hadn't done it, in some ways, you could almost put this first email as part of my core values because I'm really talking about how I'm fun and how I have fun doing this. And so in some ways, this was foreshadowing what is one of my core values, but I wouldn't consider it that. I would consider it more of kind of introducing me in my origin story. So review this. You can download it in the little box below, and you can kind of go through this very simple sequence. Now, I'm also going to have I also have a video here that you can look at and see my now newer, more involved welcome sequence to take a look at as well.